Nathan Carter had seen his fair share of battles. As a former Army Ranger, he'd been deployed to places most people couldn't even fathom. But none of those battles were as frustrating or personal as the one he was about to face in the suburbs. After retiring, he'd bought his dream home, peaceful, with a large backyard where he could spend his days tinkering with old cars, a hobby that brought him comfort after years of service. His house, located on a quiet street lined with oak trees and well-kept lawns, was a place he could finally call his own. The suburban retreat was everything Nathan had imagined. The house, a brick ranch with white trim, stood proudly at the end of the cul-de-sac. The backyard featured a meticulously maintained garden, and the garage, his sanctuary, was filled with old tools, car parts, and the engine of his prized 1967 Mustang. The last thing Nathan needed was a group of overbearing neighbors deciding to play judge and jury on his lifestyle. Enter Karen. Karen was the self-proclaimed queen of the Homeowners Association, HOA. And if there was one thing Karen loved more than enforcing ridiculous rules, it was her sense of control over the neighborhood. She had become the HOA president about a year ago, and since then, the once friendly neighborhood had transformed into a battleground of petty complaints and arbitrary fines. Karen seemed to have an opinion about everything, from mailbox colors to whether or not your lawnmower was too loud. Nathan's first run-in with Karen came one quiet Saturday morning, while he was in his garage, working on his Mustang. The rhythmic hum of the engine was soothing, but it was abruptly interrupted by a knock on his garage door. Startled, Nathan turned off the engine and looked up to see Karen standing there, clipboard in hand, with an all-too-satisfied smirk on her face. "Morning, Nathan," she chirped, not bothering to hide her disapproval. "I noticed you've been spending a lot of time in here lately. It's a bit much, don't you think?" Nathan squinted in confusion. "Excuse me?" Karen didn't flinch. "Well, the noise," she continued, her tone dripping with condescension. "It's a disturbance to the neighborhood. The rules are clear. You can't be using power tools or working on vehicles during the weekend. It's in the HOA guidelines. I'm going to have to issue a warning." Nathan's blood began to boil. He had spent years serving his country, risking his life, and now this woman was telling him how to live in the home he'd worked so hard to obtain? This wasn't just a simple nuisance. It was a challenge. He wasn't about to let Karen, or any HOA, control how he spent his free time. "I'm not doing anything wrong," Nathan said, his voice steady but firm. "If you've got an issue, you can take it up with the city. I'm within my rights." Karen's smile faltered for just a moment before returning with even more smugness. "I'm sure you'll find that the city doesn't really care about your rights when it comes to HOA regulations. We have jurisdiction over this neighborhood, and if you don't comply, we can fine you. It's that simple." Nathan stared her down. He wasn't intimidated. This wasn't just about a fine. This was about his right to live peacefully in his own home. "You've got a lot of nerve, Karen, but you'll be hearing from me. Don't think for one second that I'm just going to roll over." Karen gave a sharp nod, as if she were certain she had won. "We'll see about that," she said with finality, before turning on her heel and walking away, her heels clicking against the concrete as she disappeared down the street. Nathan exhaled slowly, his fists clenched. He knew this wasn't the last he'd see of Karen, and when the first fine arrived, he was ready. But little did Karen know, she had just picked a fight with the wrong person. HOA's first power move. The fine arrived on a Monday morning, $2.54, excessive garage use. The letter, typed in bold red ink, seemed like a petty attack, yet Nathan knew better than to ignore it. His first instinct was to toss it straight into the trash. But the more he thought about it, the more it boiled his blood. He wasn't about to let Karen and her HOA buddies tell him how to live in his own home. The rules were clear. No vehicles could be worked on outside of designated hours. Nathan had been working on his Mustang for years, and now, according to Karen's twisted interpretation, even an afternoon spent in his garage was considered an offense. He was furious, but he kept his calm. He'd dealt with worse challenges before, and this was just another fight to be won. As he opened the envelope, a heavy feeling settled in his stomach. The letter detailed not only the fine but also a series of warnings about his property. Apparently, Karen had been keeping a closer eye on him than he'd realized. Violations, she had called them. Everything from the slight discoloration of his fence to the old car parts in his garage. To her, it wasn't just about enforcing some bylaws. It was about control, power, and worst of all, making everyone follow her rules. Nathan wasn't about to let this slide. The rules weren't clear when it came to the garage, and even if they were, he wasn't breaking any laws. He grabbed his phone and dialed the number listed at the bottom of the letter. It rang twice before a voice answered. "Hello, this is Karen from the HOA. How can I help you?" Nathan's voice was calm but firm. "Karen, this is Nathan Carter, and I'm calling about the fine you sent me. I don't think you understand. I'm not breaking any laws, and I'm not going to pay this." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Nathan, I think you're misunderstanding. The HOA has specific guidelines, and we have every right to enforce them. The fine is final." Nathan leaned back in his chair, his hands clenched around the phone. "You don't have the right to tell me how to live in my own home. I've done my research. You're out of line." Karen's tone shifted, sharper, more condescending. "I'm just doing my job, Nathan. If you want to challenge it, you can come to the next HOA meeting. But I suggest you pay up before it escalates." Nathan's anger flared. "I'll be there. And don't think for a second that this is over." As the conversation ended, Karen's smugness lingered in the air. Nathan could almost hear her smirk. But now the gloves were off. If she thought he was going to back down over a petty fine, she was sorely mistaken. The next day, as he stepped out to the garage to start his car, he noticed something strange. A woman with a clipboard was standing at the end of his driveway, jotting something down. She looked familiar, but Nathan didn't recognize her. He narrowed his eyes as she glanced up, her face twisted into a forced smile. Karen's lackey. Before Nathan could say anything, the woman turned and walked up the street, her head down. He followed her with his eyes, his gut telling him something wasn't right. Sure enough, by the time he walked back to his garage, a city inspector pulled up at the curb, his vehicle parked across the street. Nathan's heart raced. This was no coincidence. "Hey!" Nathan called out, striding toward the inspector. "What are you doing here?" The inspector, a middle-aged man with a balding head and disheveled uniform, looked uncomfortable. "I'm just here to do a routine inspection," he said, his voice low. "No need to cause trouble." Nathan felt a surge of realization wash over him. Karen had escalated it. She had called in the city inspector to intimidate him. She wasn't satisfied with just the fine. Now, she was pushing for something more. Something bigger. He wasn't going to let her get away with it. Nathan stood his ground. "I'm not breaking any laws, and I don't want any more of your inspectors here. Tell Karen that if she wants a fight, she's got one." The inspector, clearly uncomfortable, raised his hands. "Look, I'm just doing my job. If you have a problem, you can take it up with Karen." The word stung. This wasn't just a power move. It was a game Karen was playing, using the city's resources to target him personally. Nathan turned on his heel, heading back to his house. This was war, and Karen had just made the first move. The HOA escalates the conflict. Karen wasn't the type to back down easily. After Nathan had confronted her through the inspector, she seemed more determined than ever to break him. It wasn't just about the fine anymore. This was personal. Karen wasn't just defending the HOA's rules. She was trying to prove a point, to establish her dominance over the neighborhood. Within a few days, another letter arrived. This time, the HOA wasn't playing around. The letter detailed a list of new violations. None of them real, but each one more absurd than the last. Nathan's fence was too high. His garden wasn't aligned with the neighborhood's approved aesthetic. And according to Karen, his driveway was unsightly due to some oil stains from years of working on his cars. Nathan could barely contain his frustration. He'd had enough of this nonsense. He sat down at his desk, scribbling a quick note to his lawyer. But even before the letter could be sent, Karen's next move came. He was at the local coffee shop when his phone buzzed. It was an email from the HOA's legal department. Final notice. Compliance required by 5 p.m. today. Failure to comply will result in the initiation of a lawsuit and eviction proceedings. Eviction? For what? For parking his truck in his own driveway? For maintaining a garden? The absurdity of it all left Nathan stunned for a moment. But his mind quickly shifted into problem-solving mode. Karen's threats were baseless, and she knew it. She had no legal ground to stand on. That night, Nathan spent hours going through the HOA bylaws, cross-referencing local city codes, and taking notes. The more he dug, the more he discovered discrepancies. Inconsistent fines, rules that weren't in the original HOA agreement, and the name of a disgruntled former board member who had been forced out under suspicious circumstances. As he pieced together the puzzle, it became increasingly clear. Karen was not just enforcing rules, she was running a racket. Meanwhile, Word of Karen's overreach was starting to spread through the neighborhood. Residents who had once been too afraid to speak up were beginning to whisper about the HOA's unfair treatment. Nathan had always prided himself on his ability to stay under the radar, but this fight was bigger than him. People needed to know what Karen was doing, and he wasn't going to let her get away with it. Not now. He reached out to a few neighbors, starting with the ones who had received complaints and fines. They were wary at first, but Nathan was persuasive. Slowly, they began to share their experiences. Stories of arbitrary fines, unexplained penalties, and Karen's increasingly erratic behavior. Some of them mentioned the board members, who were clearly terrified of Karen's power. But a few confessed they were starting to see through her facade. One neighbor, Tom, had even kept a folder full of HOA violation notices. He wasn't alone. Others had been collecting similar evidence. With each new piece of information, Nathan's resolve strengthened. Karen wasn't just a bad neighbor. She was running a corrupt system. And it was time to expose her. The next HOA meeting was just days away, and Nathan planned to be there. Armed with his evidence, he would confront Karen and her board members. He wasn't about to let them get away with destroying his neighborhood. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about standing up for everyone who had been oppressed by Karen's so-called rules. But as the meeting approached, things started to spiral further out of control. Nathan wasn't the only one Karen was targeting. His investigation uncovered a pattern. Every homeowner who had ever challenged Karen found themselves subjected to escalating fines, false accusations, and in some cases, forced sales of their homes. This was more than just a power trip. It was financial manipulation, and it was happening right under their noses. Nathan's heart pounded as he prepared for the fight ahead. He was about to wage war on an enemy that was much bigger and more dangerous than he'd initially realized. But with the community behind him and the evidence on his side, he was ready to take Karen down, once and for all. The HOA oversteps and the protagonist strikes back. The HOA had made its move, again. This time, it wasn't just a fine. Karen had gone one step too far. As Nathan walked into his driveway one evening after work, he noticed a few unfamiliar faces standing near his Mustang. Two men, dressed in yellow safety vests, were digging up his driveway. The concrete was being ripped up right in front of his eyes, and a large truck with the HOA's logo parked nearby. Nathan's blood ran cold. He was only gone for a few hours, yet here they were, completely destroying his property. His garage was already under fire for excessive use, and now they were targeting his driveway? This was no longer about fines. It was an all-out assault on his home. What the hell is going on here? Nathan shouted, striding toward the workers. One of the men looked up and stammered, we've been asked to. I don't care what you've been asked to do. Nathan interrupted, voice booming. Who gave you permission to tear up my property? The worker glanced nervously at the truck and muttered. The HOA said we need to fix the driveway. Nathan turned his gaze toward the truck, where Karen was sitting in the passenger seat. She looked at him with a smug, almost taunting grin. Karen, Nathan shouted, taking long strides toward her. This is it. You've crossed the line. You don't get to come onto my property and destroy it like this. Karen rolled down the window slowly, her voice sweet and mocking. Oh, Nathan, I'm just making sure you comply with the rules. Your driveway is a safety hazard, and the HOA has decided to fix it for you. You're welcome. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. She had no authority to do this, and Nathan wasn't going to let her get away with it. You think you can just show up here and start tearing up my driveway without notice? I didn't agree to any of this. Karen leaned back in her seat, unfazed. You've had plenty of chances to comply. You chose not to, so now the HOA is taking action. You can't stop us. Nathan's heart raced as he felt the weight of the situation. But this time, Karen had made a huge mistake. This was no longer about rules, it was about power. And Nathan was going to expose her for the tyrant she truly was. Without another word, Nathan turned on his heel and walked straight into his house. His mind raced as he grabbed his phone. He had to move quickly. A few minutes later, he was on the phone with a lawyer. I'm not sure if this qualifies as vandalism or trespassing, but this is definitely illegal. The HOA can't do this, Nathan said, his voice steady with purpose. His lawyer agreed, explaining that the HOA had overstepped its bounds. They could not force property changes without the homeowner's consent or a formal order. Nathan was determined to make this public, and he wasn't going to let Karen get away with her blatant misuse of power. Within the hour, Nathan sent out an email to every neighbor he could contact, explaining what had happened. He included photos of the damage, the destruction of his property, and a detailed breakdown of the HOA's illegal activities. The community needed to see what was going on behind closed doors. The next HOA meeting arrived quickly, and Nathan was prepared. Armed with his lawyer's advice and the support of his neighbors, he was ready to confront Karen and the board. When he entered the community hall, the murmur of voices quieted, and all eyes turned to him. The board members looked uncomfortable, and Karen's face, which was usually so smug, had a trace of worry in her eyes. Nathan stood tall, projecting his voice confidently. "I'm sure you've all heard about what's been happening on my property," he began. "Well, I'm here to tell you that the HOA's actions are not only illegal, they're completely outrageous. This board, and especially Karen, has been breaking the law for far too long." The room went silent. Karen's face flushed as she tried to mask her panic, but Nathan could see through the facade. The evidence was clear, and the community was listening. As he continued, Nathan laid out the details of Karen's illegal behavior. He explained how the HOA had been fining residents for trivial matters, threatening legal action without cause, and using their position for personal gain. He had gathered enough evidence to put Karen's corruption into the spotlight, and he wasn't going to back down. By the time Nathan finished speaking, the room was buzzing with shock and disbelief. It was clear that Karen had underestimated just how far Nathan would go. Her smug smile was gone, replaced by a tense, almost panicked look. The other board members, who had been silent throughout Nathan's speech, now exchanged glances. It was over for them. Karen tried to salvage the situation by speaking up, but her voice trembled as she stammered. "This isn't how it's supposed to go. We're just enforcing the rules." Nathan wasn't having it. "The only rule you're enforcing is your own. You've broken the law. And now, I'm going to make sure everyone knows." The meeting ended in chaos. As Nathan left the hall, he could feel the eyes of his neighbors on him. The tides were turning. Karen might have thought she had all the power, but she had just Karen's final, desperate move. Karen's response to Nathan's public revelation was swift and extreme. She wasn't a woman accustomed to losing control, and now that her carefully crafted image of power was unraveling, she would do anything to maintain her hold over the neighborhood. But Nathan had already proven he wasn't someone who would just back down. The morning after the HOA meeting, Nathan woke up to a series of strange notifications on his phone. A news alert, a text from his lawyer, and most concerning of all, an official notice from the local police department. Notice of trespassing. By Karen Thompson, HOA president. The words didn't quite sink in at first. Trespassing? How could Karen, of all people, have committed such a blatant violation? But when he read the attached details, his heart sank. The police had received a complaint from one of his neighbors, stating that Karen had been caught on his property the previous night, lurking around his garage, peering through windows, and seemingly trying to find another violation to report. Karen had crossed a line. This wasn't just about petty fines or zoning regulations anymore. She was spying on him, using her position to intrude into his private life and property. And that wasn't something Nathan was going to let slide. It wasn't long before Karen showed her face again. This time, standing on Nathan's doorstep with a self-satisfied grin that made his blood boil. "Morning, Nathan," she said, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. "I just wanted to let you know that you're going to be hearing from my lawyer very soon. I'm suing you for defamation." Nathan raised an eyebrow. "Defamation? You're the one breaking the law here, Karen. Don't forget, I have proof. You've been trespassing, spying on me. Do you really want to make this worse for yourself?" Karen's expression faltered for just a second, but then she regained her composure. "You're trying to intimidate me. Well, let me tell you something. I'm not going to stand by and let you ruin everything I've worked for." Nathan kept his voice steady, but it was clear he was done playing games. "Everything you've worked for? You mean the system of corruption you've built around yourself? The lies, the illegal fines, the spying? You've dug your own grave, Karen." Before she could respond, Nathan stepped back into his house, grabbed his phone, and hit the record button. Karen had made her last mistake. He recorded her standing on his doorstep, threatening him with legal action. And then, without warning, Nathan decided it was time to escalate things further. The next step in Nathan's plan was going to hit Karen where it hurt most, her reputation. He uploaded the video to social media, tagging every local news outlet, community forum, and public record he could find. The video was undeniable. Karen had broken the law, and now, with the evidence in the open, there was no way she could back out of it. Within hours, the video had gone viral. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak up were now standing behind Nathan. The comment section flooded with people sharing their own stories of Karen's harassment and the absurd rules she had enforced. Some even went so far as to call her out for her hypocrisy and personal vendettas against certain homeowners. Karen wasn't just being exposed as a bully, she was being exposed as a criminal. The shame of it was too much for her to bear. As the video circulated, the HOA's board members began distancing themselves from her. A few of them even called Nathan privately, apologizing for their involvement and promising to hold Karen accountable for her actions. But Karen was determined to fight back. With every shred of dignity left, she called in her lawyers, threatening lawsuits and pressing charges against Nathan for defamation. But it was clear to everyone that Karen's desperation had reached a breaking point. She had no legal standing. The community knew she was guilty, and no amount of legal threats could undo the damage she had done to herself. Nathan couldn't help but feel a rush of satisfaction. It wasn't just about winning, it was about justice. The people of the neighborhood were no longer afraid of Karen. And now, the world would see her for what she truly was, a power-hungry tyrant who had overstepped her boundaries one too many times. But Karen wasn't going to give up quietly. Her final, desperate move was just beginning. HOA crumbles and Karen's downfall. The fallout from Nathan's video was swift and unforgiving. The neighborhood had been shaken by the revelations of Karen's illegal activities, and the community, once filled with fear and compliance, was now united against her. The tension that had hung in the air for months was finally giving way to action. It didn't take long for the HOA board to meet in an emergency session. Karen, visibly rattled, sat at the head of the table, her hands trembling as she tried to maintain some semblance of control. But the atmosphere had shifted. The board members who had once been afraid of her were now openly questioning her decisions. The very people who had once followed her every order were now reconsidering their loyalty. "Karen," one board member, Sarah, began cautiously, "this has gone too far. The community is in an uproar. We can't just sit by and let this continue." Karen's face flushed red with anger. "This is my HOA. I have the authority to enforce the rules. Nathan Carter is just a troublemaker." But Sarah wasn't backing down. "He's not the problem, Karen. You are. The entire neighborhood is turning against us because of your actions. We're facing lawsuits, public backlash, and we might even be investigated by the city." Another board member, Mark, chimed in. "This could cost us everything. The HOA could be dissolved if we don't take action. We need to remove you as president." Karen's eyes darted around the room, her grip tightening on the arms of her chair. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected anyone to turn on her. But it was happening. Slowly but surely, her empire was crumbling. Her attempt to salvage the situation was weak. "You can't do this to me," she spat. "I built this HOA. I made it what it is. Without me, this place would fall apart." The board members exchanged looks, and Sarah spoke again, this time more firmly. "You've made it into something corrupt, something we can't defend anymore. We're going to have to remove you from the board. If we don't, we'll all be liable for the actions you've taken." It was clear. Karen had no allies left. She was no longer the queen of the HOA. She was a liability. One by one, the board members voted to remove her from her position. The decision was unanimous. As Karen was escorted out of the meeting, she shot Nathan a glare so full of hate that it almost seemed as if she could burn him with her gaze. But Nathan stood tall, his victory now assured. Karen had lost the battle, and more importantly, her position of power. She had overstepped one too many times, and now she was paying the price. The news spread like wildfire. Neighbors came forward with their own stories, telling of how they had been manipulated and bullied by Karen in the past. The HOA was officially dissolved, its future uncertain. The fines that had been levied against residents were refunded, and the corrupt system Karen had built was finally dismantled. As for Karen, she wasn't finished, not yet. Facing legal charges, public disgrace, and the loss of her position, Karen tried to salvage what was left of her reputation. But it was too late. The damage had been done, and the people of the neighborhood had seen her for who she truly was, a self-serving tyrant who had abused her power for far too long. Within a week, Karen was forced to sell her house. The weight of the lawsuits and mounting debt made it impossible for her to stay. She packed her things in silence, no longer the confident, powerful figure she had once been. Nathan watched from his porch as the moving truck pulled away, the last remnants of Karen's reign leaving the neighborhood for good. Nathan could hardly believe it. The quiet suburban street that had once felt like a battleground was now peaceful again. The tension that had hung over his house for so long had lifted, and for the first time in months, Nathan could finally breathe easy. As he stood on his porch, looking out at the neighborhood he had fought so hard to protect, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Sarah, one of the former board members who had helped bring Karen down. "I wanted to say thank you for everything. We couldn't have done it without you. The neighborhood is better off because of your courage. I'm sure Karen's never going to forget this." Nathan smiled as he typed his reply. "No, she won't. But I think the rest of us are going to sleep a lot better tonight." The HOA faces full legal consequences. It wasn't over for the HOA just yet. While Karen had been ousted from her position and the community had rallied against her, the legal repercussions were just beginning. Nathan knew that exposing Karen's corrupt actions was only half the battle. The real war was about to begin, and it would be fought in court. Within days of Karen's removal, the city officials began looking into the HOA's practices. Complaints about overzealous fines, harassment, and illegal actions had piled up over the years, and the sheer scale of the corruption had become impossible to ignore. Nathan had already provided more than enough evidence to trigger an investigation, and soon, the entire HOA was under the microscope. The local news outlets, which had covered Karen's downfall, now turned their focus to the larger issue of how HOAs could abuse their power and the harm it caused to communities. Interviews with disgruntled residents, including Nathan, painted a picture of an HOA that had overstepped its bounds time and time again, manipulating and controlling homeowners for personal gain. It didn't take long before the legal team representing the city began to act. They started by issuing subpoenas, demanding records from the HOA board and its members. It became clear that the HOA wasn't just guilty of illegal fines and harassment. There were financial misdeeds as well. Falsified documents, fraudulent fees, and improper handling of community funds were all part of the package. The financial fallout alone would be enough to bring down the entire organization. Karen, once the proud president of the HOA, had underestimated the far-reaching consequences of her actions. While she had tried to fend off the lawsuits with her usual arrogance, it was clear that the damage had been done. The city's investigation had revealed that not only had Karen been embezzling funds, but she had been colluding with certain board members to inflate fines and pocket the excess. The truth was out, and there was no escaping it now. As the investigation gained momentum, Nathan found himself increasingly involved in meetings with lawyers and city officials. He had become the face of the movement to dismantle the corrupt HOA. His bravery and relentless pursuit of justice had inspired others, and now the city was determined to hold everyone involved accountable. The HOA's board, already reeling from the public disgrace, was now facing legal action. Several members were summoned for questioning. One by one, they began to fold under pressure, revealing the extent of their involvement in Karen's illegal operations. Each new confession added more fuel to the fire, and soon, the entire HOA was under investigation. It wasn't long before the organization was officially dissolved, and its remaining assets were seized by the city to pay off the fines and lawsuits it had accumulated over the years. For Nathan, it felt like the final, satisfying blow. The corrupt system that had terrorized the neighborhood for so long had finally collapsed under its own weight. Karen's smug arrogance had been her undoing, and now the community was free from the oppressive rules that had made their lives miserable. As the HOA crumbled, the community began to rebuild. Nathan had become an unlikely hero in the neighborhood. People who had once kept their heads down were now speaking out, sharing their stories and holding their heads high. The oppressive atmosphere that had once defined their suburban lives was gone, and in its place, there was a renewed sense of unity. It wasn't just about the victory over the HOA. It was about reclaiming their power as homeowners and as individuals. The neighborhood had become a symbol of resilience, and Nathan had led the charge. Karen, meanwhile, was left to face the consequences of her actions. As the legal battles raged on, she watched as her world fell apart around her. Her reputation was shattered, her career in ruins, and her home was being foreclosed upon due to the mounting debt from her legal troubles. Nathan couldn't help but feel a sense of poetic justice. Karen had spent years terrorizing the neighborhood, but now she was the one facing the consequences of her own greed and overreach. The neighborhood was no longer the same. It was a place where people felt safe, where they could be themselves without fear of constant scrutiny. And at the center of it all stood Nathan, proud of what he had accomplished, but also humbled by the power of a community united against corruption. As Nathan sat on his porch one evening, sipping a cup of coffee, he reflected on the long journey that had brought him to this moment. The battle with Karen had been fierce, but the victory was sweet. He had learned that standing up for what was right wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. Karen's personal downfall. It was a bitter pill to swallow for Karen. The days following the collapse of the HOA were filled with public disgrace and mounting legal battles, but nothing compared to the final blow she would receive. Her life, which had once been so carefully constructed on power and control, was now crumbling before her eyes. Karen's arrogance had been her greatest asset, but it had also been her undoing. She thought she could manipulate and control the lives of others without consequence. But now her reputation was in ruins, and her attempts to fight back only dug her deeper into a hole. The lawsuits continued to pile up, and the media didn't let her forget it. News outlets gleefully reported on her fall from grace, detailing her illegal actions, the corrupt HOA she had run, and the community that had rallied to bring her down. The more she tried to deny her involvement in the scandals, the more the truth came to light. Former board members testified against her. The city's investigation into her financial misconduct had exposed her for what she was, a power-hungry tyrant who had used the HOA as her personal playground. Karen had always prided herself on her reputation, her social status, her position of authority. But now, that reputation had been shredded. She became the subject of gossip at every corner of town. People who had once feared her now openly mocked her, and she could do nothing to stop it. The once proud woman was reduced to a cautionary tale of greed and hubris. But the hardest hit came when she was forced to sell her house. Facing overwhelming debt, legal fees, and the threat of bankruptcy, Karen was left with no choice but to put her property on the market. The same home that had once been a symbol of her power was now just another asset to liquidate. And as the moving truck pulled away, Karen's world came crashing down around her. Nathan couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction as he watched Karen's house go up for sale. After all the pain she had caused, seeing her lose everything felt like a small victory. But it was more than that. It was the culmination of everything the community had fought for. They had stood together, united against corruption, and now the one person who had caused so much harm was getting her comeuppance. As the moving truck pulled away from Karen's house for the last time, Nathan stood on his porch, reflecting on everything that had transpired. The neighborhood had come a long way since that first confrontation with Karen. The tension that had once clouded their lives was gone, replaced by a renewed sense of peace and unity. The people who had once cowered in fear of the HOA were now free. The community had taken its power back, and Karen's downfall had been the catalyst for change. It wasn't just about defeating one woman. It was about reclaiming their rights, their dignity, and their homes. For Karen, it was the end of the road. The woman who had once thought she was untouchable was now nothing more than a footnote in the town's history. And the lesson was clear. No one, no matter how powerful they thought they were, could escape the consequences of their actions forever. As for Nathan, he knew that the battle had been hard fought, but it had been worth it. He had stood up for what was right, and in the end, the community had prevailed. The people of the neighborhood could now live in peace, knowing that they had the power to protect their homes and their rights. But as the sun set on the neighborhood, Nathan couldn't help but smile. For once, things were exactly as they should be. Epilogue and final mic drop. It had been several months since Karen's downfall, and the neighborhood had finally returned to normal. The tension that had once gripped the area was now a distant memory, replaced by a sense of calm and unity. The residents who had once been afraid to speak out now shared stories of their experiences, their voices no longer stifled by fear. The neighborhood, once a divided battleground, had become a symbol of resilience and community spirit. Nathan had returned to his quiet life, though it was never quite the same. People recognized him around town, offering nods of approval and gratitude for his role in bringing the HOA's reign to an end. He had become somewhat of a local hero, someone who had stood up when it mattered, who had refused to back down in the face of injustice. But as much as Nathan appreciated the respect, it wasn't about the accolades. It was about reclaiming the peace and freedom he had worked so hard for. One afternoon, as he sat on his porch enjoying a cup of coffee, a neighbor walked by with a mischievous grin on their face. "Hey, Nathan," they called out, "we got another one of those violation notices." Figured you'd like to see it." Nathan chuckled, shaking his head as he stood up. The neighbor handed him a piece of paper. It was an official HOA violation notice, but this one was different. It was a joke, intended to mock the system that had once caused so much harm. The violation, it seemed, was for being too awesome and creating too much peace. As Nathan read the notice, he couldn't help but laugh. It was a small, humorous reminder of how far things had come. The neighborhood that had once lived in fear of Karen's rules was now free from her grasp. The very people who had once feared fines and repercussions now found joy in the freedom they had reclaimed. Nathan tucked the notice into his jacket pocket, smiling as he watched his neighbor walk away. As he turned back toward his porch, a feeling of satisfaction washed over him. It wasn't just the victory over Karen that had made this all worth it. It was the way the community had come together. They had fought back against injustice, and they had won. As the sun began to set, Nathan took one last look at the neighborhood that had been transformed. The houses were no longer just homes. They were symbols of resistance, of standing up for what was right, no matter the odds. For the first time in a long while, Nathan felt at peace. He had faced down a tyrant, fought for his rights, and won. The neighborhood was free. And as the screen faded to black, the words appeared. Sometimes, standing up for what's right isn't easy. But it's always worth it.